Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a room where the air feels thick enough to drink. The flicker of candlelight throws soft, nervous shadows on silk walls. Outside, Madrid is quiet in the way only a city under royal mourning can be. Too many people holding their breath at once. You're standing in the private chambers of the late King Ferdinand VII. And yes, you probably won't survive this in one piece. Not physically, emotionally. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, post your location and the exact time you're listening down below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a physician to kings, trained to set bones, drain fevers, and keep monarchs alive through the endless, exhausting theatre of European court life. But tonight, the king is already dead, and your job is stranger than anything you learned in anatomy lectures. Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands a few paces away, her black veil trembling in rhythm with each careful breath. Her eyes are red, though whether from grief or the hour, you can't tell. She does not waste words. Her voice, when it comes, is a fine silk wrapped around steel. It must be preserved. That's all, no details. But the way she glances at the silk-covered body on the bed tells you this isn't about his face, his crown, or even his heart. The chamber smells of beeswax, lavender from the funereal oils, and something darker, metallic, a scent that makes your tongue itch. As you approach, the sheet over Ferdinand's body sinks slightly at the chest, then rises again at the hips. That's where the Queen's gaze fixes. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's defining feature, the one under those sheets, was nature's accident, a product of his poisoned bloodline, or something worsened by crude attempts to fix himself. But here it is before you, the object of decades of whispers, physician gossip, and political jokes told behind closed doors. You've heard the rumors, its impossible proportions, its twisted shape, its place in both his shame and his pride. You draw in a slow breath, steadying your hands. Wax canvas bundles on the side table hold your tools, preserving salts, a silver syringe, a scalpel with a mother-of-pearl handle. The job is straightforward in theory: prevent decay, retain form. In practice, you know that once this is done, the king's most intimate reality will outlive the rest of him by centuries. The Queen steps closer, her perfume a sharp counterpoint to the medicinal air. You understand, she says softly, this must be done with discretion. Of course you do. Discretion is the coin of your trade. The less written, the less recorded, the safer for everyone involved. As you fold back the sheet, the breath you are holding escapes in something between awe and unease. You've treated soldiers with battlefield injuries less shocking. The thing before you is both familiar and utterly alien, like a common tool remade in some dreamer's hands without concern for practicality. You think of the countless nights this feature defined not just the man's private life, but the marriages, alliances, and very politics of Spain. The preservation process begins. Alcohol swabs, gentle drying, the slow application of curing agents. In the corner, a clock ticks away the first minutes of your long night. You work in silence except for the soft scrape of steel on porcelain dishes, the whisper of linen, and the occasional creak of floorboards under the Queen's pacing steps. Somewhere in your mind, you can't help wandering into the palace gossip you've overheard over the years, the special cushions, the screaming brides, the rare nights when court musicians had to play extra loud to cover the sounds from behind these doors. A man's anatomy, magnified into myth, could move the levers of diplomacy as surely as armies, and in Ferdinand's case, it did, though never in the way anyone wished. A draft sneaks through the shuttered windows, making the candles stutter. For a moment, the shadows seem to sway in approval or disapproval. You can't tell which. Your fingers, gloved but still tense, keep moving. The Queen eventually breaks the silence. When it is finished, it will be taken away, locked away, Her tone tells you it's not just preservation she seeks, but erasure, control over a narrative that has already slipped through to many lips. By the time you've completed the final binding, the first bird outside dares a note into the grey pre-dawn. You look at your work, a strange fusion of medicine, craftsmanship, and royal politics. It will last for centuries, perhaps hidden in some Vatican vault, perhaps only whispered about in dusty studies, but in your hands tonight, it has been transformed from mortal flesh into something closer to an artifact. You clean your tools slowly, methodically. Outside, Madrid will soon resume its normal morning sounds, the clop of hooves, the creak of carts, vendors shouting fresh bread. But here, in this guarded chamber, you've sealed away the truest relic of Ferdinand's reign, and you suspect that in doing so, you've preserved not just anatomy, but a perfect symbol of a rule that was always oversized, misshapen, and destructive to everything it touched. The truth is, long before you ever stepped into that candlelit death chamber, Ferdinand's fate was already carved into him, in blood, in bone, and in the twisted branches of his family tree. You don't need a microscope to know when centuries of royalty have been recycling the same surnames at every wedding. The Habsburgs had been perfecting the art of marrying close relatives long before the Bourbons took their turn, and by the late 18th century, the Spanish royal family had created a genetic cocktail strong enough to knock out the most robust bloodline. Historians still argue whether the most famous example of Habsburg inbreeding, the jaw so protruded it could crack walnuts, was worse than the subtler curses like mental instability, infertility, and odd physical deformities. In Ferdinand's case, you could check all the boxes. Born on October 14, 1784, at El Escorial Palace, he was the son of King Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma. Both were first cousins, the kind of match that in royal circles was considered keeping it in the family, and in medical circles was considered stacking the deck against nature. The courtiers cooed over the infant, of course. That was their job. They saw the little bundle wrapped in lace, the miniature crown embroidered onto his swaddling cloth. But a few midwives exchanged glances they wouldn't put into words, something about the proportions, something about the way the newborn's body didn't quite align with the textbook drawings. As Ferdinand grew, so did the quiet unease. By the age of 12, the boy's anatomy began developing in a way that defied easy explanation. And by anatomy, the palace physicians meant one very specific part. Medical records from this period are maddeningly sparse, thanks to royal censorship, but the few descriptions that survive are clinical in language and disturbing in content. One physician wrote that His Royal Highness was endowed with a member of such extraordinary dimension and peculiar formation that the prospect of conjugal harmony may prove challenging. The irony, in the neoclassical 18th century, the ideal male form was still borrowed from the statues of ancient Greece, compact, refined, balanced. A smaller endowment was actually considered more aesthetically pleasing, even a sign of higher breeding. But Ferdinand's case was no sculptor's fantasy. It was a grotesque exaggeration of function over form, like a tool designed without concern for the hand that would use it. Even in childhood, the boy felt the weight of being different. His tutors noticed his eyes lingered too long on himself. In the bath, not with pride, but with something closer to resentment. The whispers began early among the servants, and in a palace, whispers have a way of floating straight through gilded doors. There were, of course, other traits of the bloodline curse. His temper, quick to ignite and slow to cool. His suspicious nature, as if every friendly gesture hid a blade. His health, unpredictable, bouts of digestive troubles, fainting spells that sent ladies-in-waiting scrambling for vinaigrette bottles. And then there was the mind, sharp in certain moments, fogged in others, prone to obsessions that would later bloom into full paranoia. One fringe theory, murmured centuries later in the halls of medical history conferences, is that Ferdinand's condition was a form of partial gigantism caused by a pituitary disorder. If true, it might explain why the deformity didn't just appear, but continued to change shape over the years. Others argue it was a rare congenital curvature, compounded by scarring from later treatments. The truth may be somewhere in between, or lost entirely under layers of royal secrecy. You imagine the scene: a teenage Ferdinand, in one of the cavernous tiled baths of El Escorial, overhearing a snicker from a passing servant. It doesn't matter whether they were laughing at his body, his awkwardness, or a joke about the minister's powdered wig. The damage was the same. He would remember that sound, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure no one laughed at him again without consequence. In a way, the deformity was both a prophecy and a curse. It shaped how his parents treated him, his father retreating into hunting trips, his mother smothering him with an attention that felt more like inspection. It shaped how foreign courts regarded him, an eligible prince with an asterisk in the fine print, and it shaped how Ferdinand saw himself, not as a future ruler in control of his destiny, but as a man at the mercy of a body that refused to play by the rules. There's a saying among the older palace physicians: we treat the flesh, but it's the mind that scars. By the time Ferdinand reached the age of formal court duties, the mind was already scarred. He carried himself with the stiffness of someone hiding a flaw he assumed everyone could see. He laughed a half-second late at jokes, as though calculating whether they were about him. And in quiet moments, when he thought he was unobserved, there was a shadow on his face, the look of someone running a private, endless inventory of what could go wrong next. Looking back, you see the pattern was there from the start. This wasn't just a medical oddity. It was the seed of the man and king he would become: defensive, distrustful, obsessed with control, and inner monarchy where personal life and national fate are braided into the same rope. The knots in one inevitably strangle the other. The palace remembers everything, even the laughter you wish it would forget. You walk its marble corridors, but every polished surface feels like a mirror tilted just enough to catch your reflection in its most awkward moments. For young Ferdinand, childhood wasn't a safe cocoon of princely innocence. It was a hall of whispers, a never-ending game of dodging looks he couldn't quite interpret. It started small, servants exchanging glances when he passed in his dressing gown, tutors speaking in lowered voices behind a half-closed door. He didn't know the exact words, but he knew the rhythm of mockery. And once you've decided you're the punchline, every murmur becomes a joke at your expense. Historians still argue whether the palace staff truly made his condition a running gag, or whether Ferdinand's growing paranoia simply filled in the silences with insult. The truth, as usual, is probably tangled somewhere in between, but there's no doubt he learned early that control, over access, over information, over people, was the only way to protect himself from humiliation. One incident, recounted in the memoirs of a long-retired chaplain, shows how far this instinct went. A boy page, barely 12, accidentally entered Ferdinand's chamber while the prince was changing for an official dinner. The boy froze, realized too late his mistake, and bolted. The young prince didn't just demand the boy be dismissed, he ordered his family exiled from Madrid entirely. No public scandal, no trial, just a quiet erasure. To Ferdinand, the punishment wasn't cruelty. It was insurance. You can picture him after that, moving through the palace with calculated precision, keeping others at arm's length. Servants knocked twice and waited for permission. His valet learned to avert his gaze during fittings. Even court physicians, the very people who might have helped him, were kept on a short leash, their written notes confiscated after each consultation. There's a strange irony in it. For all his guardedness, Ferdinand also developed an almost theatrical pride in his status. If the world saw him as peculiar, he'd remind them he was royal peculiar. He became sharper with his words, learning to slice at others before they could take a swipe at him, a drop dish, a withering comment, a wrong form of address, a very public dressing down. If he couldn't change the way people saw him, he could at least control how they remembered being in his presence. Modern psychologists might call it overcompensation. Palace gossip called it the prince's weather. Unpredictable storms followed by stretches of unsettling calm. One day, he'd offer a stable boy a handful of coins for polishing his boots just so. The next, he'd have the same boy reassigned to mucking stalls for looking at him the wrong way. The wider world began to take notice too. Foreign diplomats stationed in Madrid sent coded letters home, warning their courts about the young heir's sensitivity to imagined slights and unsettled temperament. These were polite euphemisms for what everyone in the palace already knew. Ferdinand didn't forgive, and he certainly didn't forget. There's an old fringe account from a visiting Neapolitan envoy who swore he saw the boy standing alone in the palace gardens, staring down a peacock. He waited until the bird folded its tail, the envoy wrote, and only then did he smile. Odd, perhaps, but in Ferdinand's world, even an animal displaying itself might feel like competition. These years shaped his blueprint for power. He was learning that fear could be more reliable than affection. He was learning to remove people from his circle before they could even think of betraying him. And above all, he was learning to see potential enemies everywhere, a skill that, in the warped geometry of royal politics, can look a lot like strategy, until it becomes self-destruction. As you imagine him at 15, pacing his private study with that restless energy of someone plotting small revenges, it's hard not to see the through line from the awkward boy in the bath to the future king. In his fortress of suspicion, every ruler inherits a country. Ferdinand also inherited a shadow, and he wore it like armor. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with all the confidence of a young royal raised on fairy tale notions of marriage. She was barely out of girlhood, her education shaped by music tutors, etiquette masters, and ladies who told her the world would bend to her smiles. She had heard the name El Decido, the desired one, whispered about her future husband in foreign courts, and perhaps she pictured a tall, gallant figure, his devotion as flawless as his manners. The wedding itself did nothing to break the spell. The cathedral blazed with light from hundreds of candles, their scent of beeswax mixing with the citrus perfumes dabbed behind the ears of Madrid's elite. Gold thread banners hung from the galleries, and the choir's voices climbed into the vaults like smoke outside. The streets were a festival, bells ringing, crowds cheering, fountains dyed with wine. For a brief moment, even the skeptical courtiers believed this match might be the start of something bright. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand himself felt any genuine affection that day. In public, he was all courtly polish, the gentle incline of his head to her curtsy, the steadying hand at her elbow as they walked the nave. But in private, those who knew him best could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes. Marriage, to Ferdinand, was never only about companionship. It was a test of loyalty, of compliance, of whether this young woman could be shaped into a participant in his carefully managed private world. The first sign for Maria Antonia that something was amiss came before the feast was over. Her ladies were approached by one of Ferdinand's most trusted valets, who politely but firmly requested certain items be delivered to the royal bedchamber: custom-made cushions, bottles of oil, and implements whose purpose was left intentionally vague. The ladies, trained to accept oddities in royal households, did as they were told, but not without a few exchanged looks. That night, when the last toasts had been made and the doors of the chamber closed, Maria Antonia stepped into a space that felt more like an infirmary than a bridal suite. The curtains were drawn tight. The bed was high, draped in silk, but arranged with strange padded constructions. A table nearby held glass vials, folded cloths, and a small stack of linen bandages. When Ferdinand entered, he dismissed the servants with an impatient flick of his hand. He disrobed without ceremony, whatever Maria Antonia had been prepared for in the vague, moralizing talks from her elders. It was not this. Later in life, one of her ladies-in-waiting described the moment with careful understatement. Her Majesty became distressed, as though confronted by something unnatural. Maria Antonia backed away, until her shoulders met the cold panel of the wall. Her voice, high and trembling, called him a monster. The word hung in the room. Lap. Ferdinand's face did not soften. If anything, it tightened. His pride pricked deep beneath the skin. The rest of the night unfolded in a grim parody of intimacy. Physicians, yes, actual physicians, were summoned under the pretext of reassurance. They explained in careful tones that certain preparations were necessary to avoid injury. The custom cushions were positioned, the oils applied, and the process became something clinical, stripped of tenderness. A modern reader might call this the moment Maria Antonia's marriage ended. Though it had only just begun, she lay rigid, her eyes fixed on the carved canopy above, as Ferdinand proceeded with the detachment of someone overseeing a technical operation. Laudanum was administered to calm her. Though it dulled more than her nerves, it dulled her trust, her hope, and perhaps even her will. Palace chroniclers, bound by discretion, would later describe this union as troubled from the start. The truth was more brutal. That first night set a pattern neither could escape. He saw her reaction as proof of the world's ridicule, even here in the privacy of his marriage bed. She saw him not as husband or protector, but as a figure to endure, and outside their guarded chamber, the palace carried on as if nothing had changed, though the servants in the corridor could hear and remember far more than the official accounts would ever admit. From that night forward, the royal marriage moved with the precision and coldness of a medical experiment. There was no spontaneity, no lingering glances across candlelit tables, no whispered conspiracies in the quiet corners of the palace gardens. Instead, there was a schedule. The king's physicians set it, the servants prepared for it, and Maria Antonia endured it. Each attempt began with the same ritual. Ferdinand's valet would inform her ladies-in-waiting in the morning, allowing them to prepare her chamber accordingly. The custom cushions would be carried in, wrapped in discreet linen. Oils and ointments were placed within reach, their scent sharp and medicinal, erasing any trace of romance from the air. Laudanum was poured into a small crystal cup, just enough to still her trembling without rendering her unresponsive. Historians still argue whether these measures were intended to protect her or to protect Ferdinand's pride. Either way, the outcome was the same. Intimacy became an ordeal. Maria Antonia learned to approach these nights as one might approach a long, unpleasant journey. Grit your teeth. Keep your eyes on some fixed point, and pray it ends without disaster. It's tempting to imagine that the palace at large was unaware, but servants talk, and walls are thin. Courtiers began to avoid speaking too casually about the royal couple's prospects for an heir, wary of sparking the king's temper. Instead, they spoke in code. A fine harvest meant a pregnancy. Bad weather meant another month without result. The toll on Maria Antonia was swift and visible. The once bright princess who had arrived in Madrid with an eager smile now moved through her days like a shadow in silk. She flinched at the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor. She began carrying a rosary at all times, its beads worn, smooth in a matter of months from constant use. Her dependency on laudanum grew with each passing season. At first, it was only for the scheduled nights. Then, it was for the anticipation of those nights. Eventually, she took it daily, away, to soften the edges of reality, to create a small haze between herself and the duties she dreaded. By the end of the first year, the sweet, cloying smell of the opiate clung faintly to her rooms. A curious, almost fringe detail survives in the diary of one of the palace physicians. The king kept a small leather-bound ledger in which he recorded each attempt at conception, noting the date, the conditions, meaning the particular arrangements of pillows and supports, and Maria Antonia's cooperation. It reads less like a record of a marriage and more like the log of a laboratory, Modern scholars debate whether Ferdinand saw his wife's growing frailty and simply ignored it, or whether he interpreted it as yet another betrayal, her body rejecting him out of spite. He was, after all, a man inclined to see enemies in every shadow. The irony is that even here, in the most private and vulnerable space of a marriage, his paranoia shaped every interaction. You can almost picture the scene. A warm summer night, the windows of the royal apartments open to the faint hum of the city, and inside, a tableau lit by a single candelabrum, Ferdinand adjusting the supports with meticulous care, Maria Antonia lying back with glassy eyes, the physician standing by like stage hands at a performance no one wants to watch. Outside, a carriage passes, its wheels rattling on the cobblestones, drowning out the quiet sound of her whispered prayers. The ritual was meant to bring life into the world, but instead, it drained the life from the woman at its center, and with every failure, the walls between husband and wife grew higher, the air between them colder. The marriage bed had become an altar to disappointment, and the king, priest, patient, and executioner all at once kept returning, convinced that persistence would turn misery into legacy. By the third year of the marriage, hope had become something the court treated like contraband, rare, whispered about only behind closed doors, and dangerous to handle. Two pregnancies had come and gone, each leaving Maria Antonia weaker than before. The first ended in the 4th month, the second so late that the Queen nearly died from the blood loss. In both cases, the official bulletins to the public spoke of tragic misfortunes and Her Majesty's delicate constitution. The truth, of course, was never printed. The same preparations, the same mechanical procedures meant to safeguard the couple's intimacy, also strained Maria Antonia's body to the breaking point. Physicians could not say this aloud. To do so would have been to indict the king himself. Historians still debate whether the miscarriages were purely the result of her physical trauma or whether emotional exhaustion and laudanum dependency played their own part. A fringe theory, passed among later medical historians, suggests that her opiate use may have masked early warning signs of complications, depriving her of the chance for timely treatment. The court's grief after each loss was performative. Black crape on the livery, muted music at receptions, but in the private chambers of the Alcazar, grief twisted into something sharper. Ferdinand's sorrow never softened into compassion. Instead, it calcified into suspicion. He began to suspect that Maria Antonia was somehow sabotaging her own pregnancies. To him, it was the simplest explanation. If his body could do no wrong, the fault must lie with hers. Then came the death of the palace apothecary. One morning he was alive, dispensing powders and potions from his tiny oak-shelved chamber. By nightfall, he was found dead at his desk, a half-written letter under his hand. The king's agents seized the paper before anyone else could read it. Whatever was written there never saw daylight. In the absence of facts, the rumors multiplied that he had confessed to supplying Maria Antonia with abortifacients, that he knew too much about the king's medical peculiarities, that his death was no accident. Maria Antonia herself moved through the palace in a haze, thinner and paler than any portrait painter dared depict. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she sometimes wept without knowing why, her hands still moving automatically over her embroidery. She prayed more fervently, her whispered petitions echoing in the high-ceilinged chapel long after the priests had departed. One particularly sharp memory stays with you, the image of her in the royal gardens after the second miscarriage, standing very still among the orange trees while Ferdinand paced nearby, speaking in clipped phrases to an advisor. She wasn't listening to the words. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, as though she were trying to find a point far enough away that her body and her life could no longer follow. Within weeks of her death in May 1807, fever and complications, according to the official notice, the search for a new bride had begun. Grief, at least in royal circles, has always been negotiable when succession is at stake. Ferdinand observed the necessary mourning rites, but there was an undeniable swiftness in the way marriage negotiations resumed, whether Maria Antonia died of illness, despair, or the cumulative weight of her marriage. The palace buried her as a queen and remembered her as a failed vessel for an heir. But the physicians, the servants, and a few quiet chroniclers kept another memory of a young woman caught in a machinery that ground her down until there was nothing left to preserve. The wedding of Ferdinand to Isabel of Portugal was, on the surface, another triumph of royal diplomacy, to branches of the Bourbon family retying the knot in hopes that this time the bloodline would yield an heir. Isabel was even younger than Maria Antonia had been, with a face still more suited to portraits of debutantes than to the stern oil canvases of queens. She arrived in Madrid with a trousseau heavy with lace and optimism, neither of which would survive her first year at court. The ceremony followed the usual script: gilded carriages, white horses, choirs in full voice. To the people of Madrid, the pageantry was a reassurance that the monarchy, though battered, remained intact. Inside the palace, however, the air was tense. Those who had served during the previous marriage knew what awaited in the royal apartments. They remembered the custom cushions, the medical instruments, the bottles of laudanum, and they knew that for all Isabel's youth and beauty, she was about to face the same trial. Historians still argue whether Isabel had been warned. Some accounts suggest her ladies-in-waiting were briefed by discreet physicians from the Portuguese court. Others insist she was kept entirely ignorant, either out of misplaced kindness or calculated diplomacy. What is certain is that whatever she had been told did not prepare her for the reality. The first night replayed the same grim choreography. The chamber prepared with almost surgical precision, the oils warmed, the special supports arranged. Isabel, already nervous, found her unease turning to horror as the king disrobed. Witnesses, discreetly removed before the moment of intimacy, later described hearing a sharp cry, followed by the muffled sounds of persuasion. From that night, her health began a slow decline. She lost weight rapidly, her appetite dwindled, and she developed what palace physicians referred to delicately as nervous episodes. In plainer language, she startled easily, avoided eye contact, and sometimes seemed not to recognize those around her. Ferdinand, true to form, interpreted her fear as insult. He became convinced that she was speaking ill of him to her attendants, perhaps even conspiring with foreign agents to mock him. Her letters home were intercepted. Visitors from Portugal were vetted and shadowed by his spies. The Queen's private garden walks, once an escape for royal consorts, now required an escort at all times. One fringe anecdote, preserved in the diary of a chambermaid, claims that Isabel once locked herself in her dressing room for 3 days, refusing all food except bread and water, insisting she was fasting for clarity. Whether this was an act of protest or simply a desperate attempt to exert control over something in her life, no one could say. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir deepened. The attempts at intimacy became more frequent, the preparations more elaborate. Foreign physicians were consulted under layers of secrecy, each bringing new devices or treatments that promised to solve the problem. None did not. By the second year, Isabel's once bright presence had dimmed entirely. She moved through the palace like a wraith, her footsteps soft on the marble, her eyes unfocused. The courtiers, though forbidden to speak of it, exchanged knowing looks. The second queen was fading just as the first had, and the king, rather than seeing the pattern, saw only a conspiracy, another wife who, in his mind, had failed him deliberately. By the middle of Isabel's second year as queen, the royal bedchamber had become something closer to an anatomical theatre than a place of rest. Ferdinand's desperation for an heir had broken free from the boundaries of privacy, drawing in an audience that no bride and few husbands would ever tolerate. Foreign physicians began to arrive in discreet intervals, often under false names, slipping into the palace through service entrances. Officially, they were consultants on matters of general royal health. In reality, they were there to witness the king's intimate failures firsthand and propose remedies. Some were respected anatomists from universities in Germany or France. Others were self-styled experts in marital mechanics, a category that could include anyone from country healers to traveling performers with a talent for physical feats. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand genuinely believed these outsiders could help him, or whether their presence was a twisted way of proving to himself, and perhaps to them, that his difficulties were not his fault. Either way, their visits transformed the private space between husband and wife into a public, albeit very select stage. On more than one occasion, Isabel found herself the object of clinical scrutiny. These men offered suggestions, adjusted equipment, or muttered in languages she didn't understand. The process was humiliating beyond measure. A fringe account from a young court physician claims that one Italian expert actually made sketches during the proceedings, later circulating them among medical students in Naples. The effect on Isabel's mind was devastating. Her nervous episodes became more frequent. Servants reported that she would sometimes startle so violently at a sudden noise that she would knock over tables or spill ink across her correspondence. At other times, she seemed to drift into a vacant stare, her hands folding and unfolding, the same scrap of lace for hours. Meanwhile, beyond the bedroom, the political situation was beginning to fray. Colonial uprisings simmered across the Atlantic, and European allies, hearing rumors about the king's domestic troubles, began to wonder whether Spain could be counted on as a stable partner. Satirical pamphlets, printed just across the border in France, depicted Ferdinand as a grotesque figure, his crown slipping, his scepter warped into something unfit for statecraft. Ferdinand responded, as he always did, with tighter control. Access to the Queen was restricted even further. Palace corridors were patrolled at night to ensure no one could overhear the royal treatments. Courtiers suspected of gossiping were reassigned to remote provinces or abruptly retired with polite but unmistakable force. The king's vexation had become an unspoken axis around which the palace revolved. Banquets were cut short, audiences postponed, all to make way for scheduled attempts or to accommodate the travel of yet another specialist. Even when nothing happened, the air was thick with the expectation that something might. One evening, after a particularly disastrous session that left Isabel faint and the visiting physician muttering apologies, Ferdinand was seen pacing the gallery alone, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. A courtier passing at a distance heard him speaking under his breath, not to himself, but to an imagined rival. They will not laugh at me, but of course, in some corners of Madrid, they already were. The inevitable came quietly, as most palace tragedies do. In 1818, after only 2 years of marriage, Queen Isabel was dead. The official statement from the royal household spoke in the language of dignity and distance. Her Majesty succumbed to the effects of nervous exhaustion. But those who had watched her fade knew the truth was messier, sadder, and much more dangerous to speak aloud. The signs had been there 4 months, the increasingly frail frame, the stutter that had crept into her speech, the tendency to flinch when anyone approached from behind. Some days, she seemed to forget entirely where she was, her eyes scanning the room if searching for an exit. In the last weeks, she rarely left her chambers at all. Historians still debate whether her death was hastened by self-neglect, illness, or, in the darkest version of the story, subtle forms of self-harm that no one dared to stop. A fringe account from a dismissed lady-in-waiting claims Isabel had been skipping meals deliberately, convinced that if she could make herself too fragile, the ritual nights would finally end. Ferdinand's public grief was textbook, black attire, solemn masses, the traditional mourning period observed to the letter. In private, however, The reaction was less about loss and more about betrayal. He became convinced that Isabel had been part of a conspiracy, that her death was somehow orchestrated by foreign enemies to keep him from producing an heir. Within days, several of her Portuguese attendants were arrested on suspicion of espionage. Their rooms were searched, their correspondence seized, some were quietly deported. Others simply disappeared from the palace without explanation. It was a purge disguised as justice, and it served a second purpose, to erase as many witnesses as possible to the Queen's final months. Beyond the palace gates, the ripple effects reached Europe's royal courts. Princesses and their advisors read the news with a mixture of pity and caution. 2 young queens dead within a decade, both leaving no heir, was enough to make even the most politically ambitious families hesitate. Negotiations for Ferdinand's third marriage slowed to a crawl. In some cases, they stalled entirely when discreet inquiries revealed the king's special circumstances. The Spanish Foreign Ministry, desperate to avoid isolation, began offering unprecedented concessions to potential matches, dowry exemptions, trade agreements, even promises of separate living quarters for any new queen. But still, the hesitation persisted. No one wanted their daughter to be the next ghost walking the corridors of the royal palace inside Madrid. The king's circle tightened. His closest advisors were the ones willing to reinforce his narrative, that both his wives had been victims not of his condition or his temper, but of treachery aimed at the Spanish crown. It was a dangerous fiction, but one that kept Ferdinand insulated from the truth, and from any impulse to change. And so the palace, draped again in mourning crepe, began the quiet, calculated process of preparing for a new bride. The chandeliers would be polished, the tapestries aired out, the guest chambers readied. Publicly, it was framed as a hopeful search for the future mother of Spain's heir. Privately, it was more like setting the stage for the next act in a play everyone had already seen, and no one wanted to watch again. When Maria Josepha of Saxony agreed to marry Ferdinand in 1819, it wasn't for love, nor even for the romance of a crown. Her family's finances were in shambles, and the Spanish matchy, risky as it seemed, promised stability, influence, and the kind of security that could rescue an entire household from ruin. She was 24, older than Ferdinand's previous brides, and with an education that had leaned heavily on music, languages, and the pragmatic politics of survival. Unlike Isabel, Maria Josepha had been warned. Saxon court physicians, having quietly corresponded with their Spanish counterparts, gave her an unvarnished assessment of the marital challenges ahead. She arrived in Madrid not with girlish fantasies, but with a travelling case of ointments, small medical devices, and a personal physician who had discreet experience in difficult conjugal matters. Historians still argue whether her foreknowledge made her more resilient or simply resigned. She approached her role less like a bride, and more like a specialist assigned to an impossible case. There would be no swooning, there would be observation, note-taking, and adjustments. In that sense, she became the first of Ferdinand's wives to meet his meticulous rituals with her own. The first nights followed the by now standard pattern, the bed prepared, the supports positioned, the oils measured. But where Maria Antonia and Isabel had submitted in silence, or with visible distress, Maria Josepha asked questions. She conferred with the attending physicians, adjusted the cushions herself, and made notes afterward, written in a coded shorthand only she and her doctor understood. This clinical detachment seemed, at first, to suit Ferdinand. Here was a queen who did not scream, who did not faint, who participated without open disgust. Yet as weeks turned to months, that same detachment began to gnaw at him. He started to suspect she wasn't approaching him as a husband at all, but as a specimen, an object of study, harder than affection. A fringe anecdote from the journal of her personal physician reveals that Maria Josepha once remarked, "If I cannot give Spain an heir, I can at least give its doctors a complete record." Whether this was sarcasm or genuine pragmatism, It captures the tenor of the marriage, to people bound together by duty, each seeing the other through a professional lens. Outside the bedroom, she performed her public role flawlessly, presiding over receptions, corresponding with foreign courts, commissioning works from Spanish artists, but she kept her personal life guarded, rarely confiding in her ladies-in-waiting. Perhaps aware that Ferdinand's spies were never far, the king's paranoia did not abate. He began intercepting her correspondence, convinced that she was sending reports back to Saxony about his condition. Even the presence of her personal physician became a point of tension. Ferdinand alternated between tolerating him and suspecting him of betrayal. Still, the routine continued. Twice a week, the elaborate preparations, the measured doses, the coded notes. The marriage was less a romance than a controlled experiment, one in which both participants were careful not to let their true thoughts slip. And in the grand halls of the palace, where portraits of past monarchs gazed down in oil and gilt, there was no hint of the quiet contest being played out behind the locked doors of the royal apartments. For 10 years, Maria Josepha endured the routine without open rebellion, and for 10 years, Ferdinand clung to the belief that perseverance would yield his long-sought heir. Then, in early 1829, a shock rippled through the palace. Maria Josepha was pregnant. The announcement was handled with both ceremony and caution. Ferdinand, almost dizzy with triumph, summoned physicians from across Europe to confirm it. The court erupted in a strange mix of celebration and disbelief. After 2 failed marriages and a decade of methodical, often humiliating effort, this seemed almost miraculous. Historians still debate what had changed. Some suggest subtle modifications to the marital equipment finally eased the strain on Maria Josepha's body. Others, more cynically, whisper that the father might not have been the king at all, a theory that has never been proven, but has never fully disappeared from the margins of historical commentary. Regardless, Ferdinand treated the pregnancy like a siege. Guards were posted at the Queen's chambers day and night. Her food was inspected with a rigor that bordered on absurd. Each meal tasted in triplicate by nervous servants. Religious relics were placed under her pillows, and every visitor, even family, was scrutinized for possible ill intent. For a few months, hope seemed to bloom in Madrid. The court planned for christenings, foreign envoys prepared congratulations, and the Spanish people began to imagine stability. But in the 7th month, complications arose. Maria Josepha suffered sudden, severe pains. Her physicians suspected placental abruption, a condition dangerous even in the best circumstances, but their efforts were hindered by Ferdinand's interference. He insisted on consulting mystics alongside the doctors, delaying treatments, while he weighed their conflicting advice. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The birth was harrowing, the room stifling with heat and fear. Ferdinand insisted on being present, barking orders he had no qualification to give. The child, a daughter, lived only a few hours. 3 weeks later, Maria Josepha followed her. Officially, she died of childbed fever, but those close to her suspected a lethal blend of infection, exhaustion, and quiet despair. What followed bordered on the macabre. Ferdinand refused to permit burial. For nearly a week, the bodies of his wife and daughter lay in the palace, the air growing thick with the scent of decay. While he demanded the physicians try again, there were poultices, whispered prayers, even bizarre mechanical contraptions brought from the royal workshops. Nothing, of course, could alter the truth. Only when the court itself began to verge on open revolt did he relent. The coffins were closed, the funeral rites held, and the palace was draped in mourning for the 3rd time in his reign. The tragedy did not bring humility. If anything, it deepened the grooves of Ferdinand's paranoia. The Queen's death became, in his mind, yet another proof of the world's conspiracy against him. And in the shadows of the chapel, where the candles guttered low, plans for another marriage were already taking shape. Later in 1829, before the mourning tapestries had even been taken down, Ferdinand's advisors were already courting a new candidate. The choice fell on Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, another cousin, because the royal family tree insisted on folding back in on itself. She was 23, quick-witted, and, as it turned out, carrying a secret. When her carriage rolled into Madrid that November, more than one courtier noticed she was already showing. The polite fiction was that she possessed a robust constitution, but the swelling under her gown told a different story. Ferdinand either chose not to acknowledge it or convinced himself that this was a sign of divine providence, a pregnancy arriving without the usual trials, neatly timed to solve his succession crisis. Historians still argue whether he truly believed the child was his. Some suggest he was willing to overlook the obvious in exchange for an heir. Others think he simply preferred the comfort of a lie he could control. Whatever the truth, he embraced the impending birth as if it were the long-awaited vindication of his reign. On October 10, 1830, Maria Cristina delivered a healthy daughter, christened Isabella. Madrid celebrated, though whispers in the corridors and marketplaces alike noted the inconvenient math. Isabella would grow up as Isabella II, the future Queen of Spain, the living embodiment of both Ferdinand's triumph and his most private failure. Inside the palace, the pattern of control resumed almost immediately. Ferdinand was determined to produce another child, one whose paternity he could claim without doubt. Maria Cristina, still recovering from childbirth, found herself drawn into the same elaborate rituals as her predecessors: the hidden cushions, the attending physicians, the guarded doors. A fringe detail survives in the letters of one of her ladies-in-waiting. The king's conviction that certain lunar phases increased the likelihood of male heirs. These nights were marked by extra preparations, astrologers' charts spread out beside the bed like military plans. Despite the new queen's more modern sensibilities, she quickly discovered that resistance was not an option. Ferdinand's need to assert control over the process was relentless. He treated the palace like a laboratory, and she, like the others before her, was both subject and specimen. In public, Maria Cristina wore the crown with composure. In private, she was already learning how to navigate the tightrope between compliance and self-preservation. It was a balancing act her predecessors had failed to master, and one that would define her life until Ferdinand's last breath. By the early 1830s, the royal palace no longer felt like a seat of power. It felt like a fortress under siege. Ferdinand's paranoia had matured into a fully engineered system of control, one that transformed even the most intimate corners of Maria Cristina's life into WERS. The first changes were structural. Hidden passages were carved between chambers, so the king could appear in her rooms without warning. In some cases, they were old service corridors reopened. In others, brand new crawlways designed specifically for surveillance. Guards were rotated daily to prevent familiarity, a word Ferdinand now used as if it were synonymous with treachery. Historians still argue whether his measures were born of genuine fear for his life or an unshakable conviction that Maria Cristina was plotting against him. Either way, the effect was the same. Every conversation, every gesture, even the way she poured her tea, was monitored. Before any physical contact, even the chaste kind, the queen was ordered to submit to medical examinations. Palace physicians, eyes lowered and voices muted, checked her skin for traces of toxins that might be absorbed by touch. These rituals weren't private either. Ferdinand insisted on witnessing them, as if his presence could guarantee their honesty. One fringe account from a courtier's diary claims that the king had tiny spy holes drilled in the walls between their chambers. Servants occasionally glimpsed him there, one eye pressed to the opening, watching Maria Cristina as she prayed, read, or simply sat in silence. If she shifted in a chair or paused mid-page, he might send for her moments later, demanding to know her thoughts. In this gilded cage, Maria Cristina began to develop her own coping mechanisms. She learned to control her breathing, to keep her hands still, to let her expression rest in a mask of calm, even when her pulse was racing. She confided to no one, not even her most trusted ladies, for fear of their words being carried back to the king. Meanwhile, the city outside sensed the atmosphere tightening. Palace staff moved with the stiffness of soldiers in occupied territory. Visitors found their access restricted, their conversations shadowed. Even Ferdinand's ministers had to navigate contradictory orders. One day urged to protect the Queen's comfort, the next to investigate her suspicious absences from the nursery. The result was a home that felt less like the censor of a kingdom and more like a living diagram of Ferdinand's mind, winding corridors of suspicion, chambers echoing with unspoken accusations, unlocked doors that were as much symbolic as physical. And through it all, the marital project continued as scheduled, supervised, stripped of tenderness, a ritual now performed under the constant gaze of a man convinced that both his wife and the world beyond those palace walls were conspiring against him. By 1833, Ferdinand was a man collapsing in on himself. The layers of control and suspicion he had built over decades now hemmed him in as much as they did anyone else. His health was failing, the old digestive troubles returning, his hands trembling when he signed decrees, his gait slowed by gout that even the most elaborate state carriage could not disguise. But the physical decline only sharpened his paranoia. Ministers noticed that his audiences grew longer and more erratic, drifting from matters of state into breathless accusations about imagined plots. He would interrupt reports on crop yields to ask whether the Queen's attendants had been smiling too much at visiting diplomats. Historians still argue whether these final years were marked by the onset of cognitive decline or whether the paranoia itself had simply reached a breaking point. Either way, decisions that once took hours now dragged on 4 weeks, tangled in layers of suspicion. Urgent matters, colonial uprisings, fiscal crises, sat neglected, while Ferdinand reviewed guard rosters or personally inspected the hinges on Maria Cristina's doors. The rituals in the bedchamber did not stop, though they became less frequent. Age made each attempt more taxing, yet Ferdinand seemed unable to accept the obvious truth. He doubled down on talismans, herbal concoctions, even prayers whispered over astrological charts. A fringe anecdote from one of the Queen's ladies claims that in his final year, he had a court musician play the same 3 melancholy notes on a viol each night, convinced the sound would summon fertility. Outside the palace, Spain was fracturing. The American colonies were gone, the treasury nearly empty, and the Carlist faction was openly preparing to challenge Isabella's right to inherit. Yet Ferdinand spent as much energy policing the expressions on his wife's face as he did confronting political reality. By autumn, the king's physical exhaustion was unmistakable. He sometimes dozed during council meetings, waking with a start to accuse those present of trying to slip something past him. His physicians spoke in guarded tones about weakness of the heart and complications of gout, but in private, they admitted they were watching a man burn through the last of his reserves. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII died. In his bedchamber, the official cause was listed as gout, but those who had seen him up close knew better. It was exhaustion of the body, the mind, and the will, the inevitable end for a man who had spent his life locked in battle with his own anatomy and his own shadow. And outside, beyond the palace gates, Spain braced itself. The king was gone, but the legacy of mistrust and instability he had built would not be buried with him. Death did not bring simplicity. Within hours of Ferdinand's passing, the palace was already dividing itself into factions, those loyal to Maria Cristina and Isabella, and those rallying behind the Carlists. But before the politics could even fully ignite, there was one last task that fell, quietly, to the royal physicians, behind locked doors. under the same dim lamplight that had witnessed so many of Ferdinand's indignities in life, the autopsy began. Officially, it was a routine examination to confirm the cause of death. Unofficially, it was the culmination of decades of whispered speculation. The body was examined in full, and there it was, the anatomical reality that had haunted every one of his marriages. Historians still argue whether the records from that night were meant to enlighten or to bury the truth. What's certain is that detailed notes were taken, measurements made. The infamous organ, so often described in rumour, was recorded at 14 inches in length, with a dramatic taper and curvature that explained both the mechanical impossibility of normal intimacy and the repeated injuries to his partners. Internal scarring, some of it old and deep, told a quieter, sadder story. Attempts at self-surgery stretching back to his youth, crude and painful efforts to correct himself that had only worsened the condition. A fringe account from a Vatican archivist claims that the preserved organ, along with anatomical drawings and the physician's written observations, was sealed almost immediately in a private vault in Rome. Officially, this was to protect the dignity of the Spanish crown. Unofficially, it was to remove from history the most literal and intimate proof of how one man's body had shaped the fate of a kingdom. Outside those locked rooms, the ceremonies of succession unfolded with precision. Isabella II, not yet 3 years old, was proclaimed queen. The streets of Madrid rang with cheers and the clatter of horse hooves, though everyone knew the unity was brittle. The Carlist wars would erupt soon enough, fueled in part by the very doubts Ferdinand had spent his life trying to suppress. In the end, his reign left Spain poorer, politically fractured, and suspicious of itself. His obsession with control had seeped into the machinery of government, slowing every decision, stifling initiative. His paranoia had alienated allies abroad and created enemies at home. And all the while, his most private battle, the one fought behind bolted doors and drawn curtains, had been the unseen architect of it all. The preserved relic in the Vatican remains, to this day, a silent monument to that truth. Few will ever see it. Fewer still will understand the long shadow it cast, but for those who have read the hidden accounts, it stands as a reminder that history is not only shaped by grand armies and sweeping laws. Sometimes it's shaped by the quiet, unyielding weight of a single, inescapable flaw.